It's about time for everyone to get all set. Here
we go.
All right. Bonjour, good morning, everyone. We are very happy to resume our critical theory seminar. This morning, we have the great pleasure of getting to have Pierre Gervais, who is a French historian, professor at Université de la Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. And he's going to be talking about one of his major productions, Le dossier secret de l'affaire Dreyfus, the secret dossier of the Dreyfus affair. Pierre has been a professor at the Sorbonne and Maître de conférence in American history at the University of Paris VIII, Saint-Denis, Maître de conférence at University of Vincennes, Saint-Denis, and he got his habilitation in 2012 and his Ph.D. in history at University of Princeton, New Jersey, USA. Pierre, thank you so much for your kindness and availability to share some thoughts with us. Please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Nita. Thank you for having me over. A couple of questions. First of all, I have a PowerPoint, if I can share it.
Yes, please.
Probably a good idea. And while I'm trying to launch these things, which usually don't work, but I will try nonetheless, I can tell you that this project is actually not, do you see anything?
Yeah, perfect.
Good. Okay, perfect. So this project is actually not my specialty. So I'm talking off the top of my head on something I was not a specialist of. I'm actually a specialist of 18th century economics, especially merchant accounting, which is sort of far from the Dreyfus affair, as you can know. Now, this project grew out of a discussion with colleagues, especially Romain Huret and Pauline Peretz, who were at the time both at the École des Hautes Études. And it was an outgrowth of a discovery we made, especially in Jean-Denis Bredin, who wrote a big book on the Dreyfus affair, and then also on Bande Dessinée magazine, where a vulgarizer was actually talking about the Dreyfus affair and attracted our attention to a point in this book, which was that the main document of the Dreyfus affair had a very strange mention in it. And I must warn everybody that from now on, this will be not safe for work. So in case you have any children out, which you don't want to hear stuff which is underage, overage for them, I beg you to get them away. Because the main document of the Dreyfus affair, which was the letter which accused him, ce canaille de D, the scoundrel D, was actually concluded by all yours on the mouth, Maximilian, with N-E at the end, and don't bugger too much. That was the last line, buggering meaning anal sexual intercourse. So that was what the signature of the document was, and we're kind of surprised to it. It turns out that there was a whole undercurrent of things going on there. We published a book on it eventually, and I will just recap the whole line of reasoning we followed. Now, why is it connected to critical theory? I'll keep that for the last 30 seconds, so you will find out at the very end. Okay, first of all, a quick overview, maybe because not everybody is up to it on his or her Dreyfus affair, maybe. So the first stage was that a document which was proving the presence of a spy in the war ministry was leaked to the French intelligence service, which was called Section de Statistique. We'll find that again and again. It was actually stolen from the German embassy because the French counter spies had a spy in the German embassy. They were doubling as a spying organization. And the spy was emptying the wastebaskets of everybody in the embassy and found this letter which basically said, which was sent to the military attaché of the German embassy and said that without any news that you want to see me, I'll still send you a whole bunch of things on hydraulic brakes of a gun, on covering troops, which is the troops which are placed at the border so as to give time to France to mobilize. This was at the height of the revenge part of French history. They were trying to get back Alsace-Lorraine and thinking of it and thinking of having war with Germany. A note on artillery, a note on Madagascar, because the French were basically trying to invade Madagascar at the time, and the draft field artillery firing manual, which is very difficult to obtain, the guy says, whoever writes it. Now, at the time, this created quite a stir in the general staff and among spies in France, because this meant they misread it actually from the beginning, and they thought that all these informations were high-priced informations which were coming from the general staff itself, from the core of the French army. In fact, it was, as it turned out later, it was just a guy trying to make money out of second-hand interest, but they didn't know that. So they looked up and down throughout the general staff. There was a terrible witch hunt going on. Everybody was really nervous. And they zeroed in on when Captain Dreyfus was an intern at the general staff. He was not a full officer yet. And he was arrested on the basis of the fact that his handwriting looked like the handwriting in this piece. So the guy was investigating the whole thing, who was a very strange character named Dupaty de Clam, who was billing himself as a clever hound and Sherlock Holmes, and he was completely crazy and totally incompetent, decided to dictate the text of the piece to Dreyfus, and decided that Dreyfus had turned red or white or green or something and had elicited trouble, and therefore was certainly guilty. So on the basis of that, the accusation was linked. Dreyfus was arrested, and the accusation was eventually linked to the press, probably by somebody in the Secret Services, because there was no proof. And the Secret Service considered that it was proof enough, and there should be a trial, and they pushed for a quick trial, and they probably leaked it to the press, so there would be a press campaign against Dreyfus, which there was, which was very anti-Semitic, because Dreyfus was Jewish, as it turns out. And throughout November 1894, the ministry was accused of Jewish sympathies and of protecting Dreyfus. This is La Libre Parole, which was the main anti-Semitic newspaper in France, the treason of the Jew Dreyfus, and with a side column on high treason. Why is the trial taking so much time? Probably, I'm translating Drummond here, probably one hopes that, they hope that without any details, the accused will benefit from the doubt. With a little cleverness, the Jews would be turning him into an innocent person, especially if in the meantime the prisoner was suicided, as he was incited to do. The main point for the Jews clearly is to gain time. So there were all kinds of accusations flying out, mostly around anti-Semitic tropes. Eventually, Dreyfus was tried and found guilty on December 22nd, 1894. Now, the military trial, the military tribunal, actually was the place where the Dreyfus affair really started. It started because the military didn't have any proof, really, so they made one up, or a couple. Hubert Henry was a member of the Section Statistique, was one of the counter spies and spies on the French side, took the stand to swear falsely that Dreyfus was guilty, that he had proof of that some honorable person had told him so, but he couldn't reveal his proofs because they were secret. And then eventually, the Minister of War, General Mercier, gave a guy named Marie-Georges Picard, sorry, I forgot the name here, Lieutenant Colonel Marie-Georges Picard, a sealed envelope, which he claimed was containing secret proofs of Dreyfus's guilt, compiled by the Section de Statistique, and asked Picard to give it secretly to Morel, who was presiding the tribunal, after the end of the proceedings, as the judges were retiring into their chamber to deliberate on the verdict, and without the knowledge of the defense team, which obviously was a felony. This was breaking all kinds of legal rules. You don't, try to influence the jury outside of the normal proceedings, which are there for that. And there was no other proof except this handwriting thing, which was debated between experts because not everybody agreed that the two handwritings were similar. Now, Dreyfus was degraded. He was sent to Guyana in solitary confinement and hard labor. And in a second stage, the same Picard who had brought this secret dossier to the judges, that's what the secret dossier is. It's the few pieces which were given to the judges at the last minute at the end of the trial to convince them. And Picard, who had been by chance carrying it, well, maybe not by chance, he was already probably seen as a possible head of the secret services after the first head of the secret services was Colonel Sander, and he did replace Sander in July 1895, and found out through a new piece brought from the German embassy, first of all, that a guy named Esterhazy was actually a traitor and was giving information to the Germans, although low-level information because he was not very high in the hierarchy, but he was clever at making things up and making sound as if the information he gave was really important. And also he found eventually, okay, this is the piece which was stolen in the German embassy. And there's a point unclear, which is that for reasons which were never really explained, Picard ended up comparing Esterhazy's letter to the German military attaché proposing information to the original bordereau. Maybe because he had been ordered to track down, to keep the Dreyfus file open in order to track down possible accomplices of Dreyfus. So maybe he had the bordereau lying around on his office or something, but he found, once he put the two pieces next to each other, turns out it was the same writing and it was the same guy, and the bordereau had been written by Esterhazy and not by Dreyfus. Whereupon Picard was a spy, anti-Semitic himself, at least at first, but very honest, went to his superiors, that is the head of the general staff, and de Boisdeffre and his second in command, General Gons, was in charge of the Secret Service. The Secret Service was out of the normal hierarchy of the ministry. This will be important later on. And it was directly under the orders of somebody at the head of the general staff, the second in command. And he told them both that Dreyfus had to be freed, that there was a miscarriage of justice, and something should be done. Now, he also got out the dossier secret, which had been kept against the orders of the Mercier, the former Minister of War, but on the other hand, orders had been given to keep the file open, so Sander had kept the dossier, and the dossier was given to Picard, who was head of the Secret Service, so obviously had the right to see it, and Picard opened it and concluded that there was nothing in the dossier, that the dossier was empty, that there was no proof, and it reinforced him into thinking that something had to be done. And in fact, he did say to his superior, according to him at least, that if nothing was done, there was a good risk that the whole thing would blow up in the face of the French army, and it would be a disaster, which eventually it was. So in August and September, the Minister of War and their higher-ups, the higher-ups in the army, probably in agreement with the few people they consulted in the Section de Statistique, decided to keep the whole thing secret and keep Dreyfus in Guyana. They leaked the details of the 1894 trial. They published the bordereau, and they claimed that all this was above board and nice and no problem. And they sent Picard away on various missions, increasingly dangerous, and eventually on the Tunisian border, where they hoped basically that he would be killed and nothing would be heard about it. And Henry, who replaced Picard at the head of the service, put a fake document in the dossier secret, the Faux Henri, which mentioned Dreyfus by name as a final proof. This is the Faux Henri. My dear friend, I read that a deputy will call about Dreyfus, ask a question about Dreyfus. If Rome asks me for new explanations, because this was supposed to be written by the Italian military attaché to a German military attaché, both were supposed to use Dreyfus, I will say that never I had relations with this Jew. It's agreed, and if you are asked, say the same thing, because nobody must know what happened with him ever. The first stage, which I will quickly summarize, you can find it in any history book, is that obviously, as Picard predicted, the whole thing blew up. First of all, Picard told the truth to a friend of his named Louis Le Blois, because he was afraid of being killed and nothing left of what he knew. In parallel, the Dreyfus family was agitating for his innocence. Eventually, Le Blois connected with the Dreyfus defenders. In November 1897, excuse me, Dreyfus's brother published a pamphlet saying, a letter accusing Esterhazy. Esterhazy was acquitted by a military tribunal. Zola published J'accuse a few days later, recapping the whole thing and insisting that Esterhazy was guilty. At that point, the Ministry of War sued him for libel. He fled to England, but the dossier secret was brought out during Zola's trial as a proof, at least mentioned. Then there was a big uproar. The Ligue des Droits de l'Homme was created. Picard was kicked out of the army. Picard declared that the proofs in the dossier secret were not there when he saw it, and therefore were fakes. He was thrown into jail. Jaurès started defending Dreyfus, and eventually the fake Henry was discovered. Henry committed suicide in August of 1898. The Minister of War resigned, and the Cour de Cassation took up the whole thing. So that's the brief summary. There were all kinds of actors. By that time, half of France was defending Dreyfus, the other half was attacking him. All the intellectuals were weighing in. The miscarriage of justice was formally clear because of the dossier secret, precisely. And then there were the efforts of the military to silence the whole thing. So everybody was furious. The left wing eventually, not at first, but eventually went into defense mode for Dreyfus. Even though he was a captain, there was a significant amount of anti-Semitism also on the left, but above all, there was a big hostility to the army, because the army was mostly a repressive force against the workers' movement, so obviously defending a captain was not obvious, but eventually Jaurès joined in, and Clemenceau, and that's the Dreyfus affair you heard about, which was the 1898 Dreyfus affair, where, there is this famous drawing. It's a family dinner. Above all, let's not discuss the Dreyfus affair. That stopped. The grandfather says, don't mention it. And at the bottom, you see the result when they mentioned it. And everybody is trying to kill everybody else, pretty much. So the end was that eventually the Cour de Cassation, which was the appeals tribunal in France, quashed the verdict of 1894. There was a new military tribunal, which did insist on Dreyfus being guilty, even though there was still no proof. Eventually, the president pardoned Dreyfus and Picard, and there was a general amnesty. Picard was furious with Dreyfus because he wanted to go on fighting, not accept the pardon. But it turns out that even in the second military tribunal, the military had inserted fakes in the files which were given to the court, and so Dreyfus succeeded in having the Cour de Cassation reopened his case and overturned the 1899 sentencing with no possibility of appeal, which declared him innocent forever. And he was actually reintegrated in the army, but lost seniority. I mean, he lost a good 12 years of seniority, which is a lot in a military career. Whereas, interestingly, Picard did get his seniority back and ended up a general during the First World War. At the beginning of the First World War. So basically, Dreyfus was never completely reaccepted in the army, and even recently, actually, there was about 20 years ago, there was a proposal to set up a statue of Dreyfus in the middle of the École Militaire, which is the former military school in the center of Paris, and the Ministry of Defense insisted that no, they didn't want that. And the statue was essentially put in a corner of a large boulevard somewhere in the area, but far from the eyes of the military. So it's still a raw wound with the military. Whoops, that had not to be there. So there is a context, and I'm sorry, this was translated in a hurry, so there are some typos. Context shouldn't evidently include a C, because the whole thing was a spying story, but not only. First of all, it was a story of military attachés. These are the German military attachés in Paris, a bit before 1894. You have the whole of them, and you have a few major actors, especially the Italian military attaché, which is the fifth from left standing. You see his big white plume. And next to him, actually, not next to him, but at the other end, you have the German military attaché, which is third from right, with his pointy helmet, like all Germans. And this is Maximilian von Schwarzkoppen. And Schwarzkoppen and Panizzardi were part of a ring of military attachés, were communicating secret information they had received. I mean, military attachés were not called official spies, but they could have been. Their actual job was to keep tabs on the French army and get any kind of information they could on the French army, including open information, but also secret information if they could. And they ran spies in the French army, and everybody sort of knew that. And all military attachés do that, and you sort of expel them from time to time if things go out of hand. But basically, it is understood that their job is not only to put, to lay wreaths or participate in official ceremonies. Their job is to get information. Now, Schwarzkoppen and Panizzardi and Mendigoria, who was the Spanish attaché, and occasionally the American attaché, had created a ring of spies, which was particularly efficient, and they were neutralizing basically their efforts. So it was a military attaché ring, basically. And for instance, they had managed to penetrate the French geography service of the army, and had, this is a letter from 1894, which was sent, this is actually sent by Schwarzkoppen, or was going to be sent by Schwarzkoppen, and then eventually Schwarzkoppen tore it up and threw it away and started over again, but the original version was kept by the French service through the waste paper basket lady, and the translation is, you have 600 francs in advance. For these 600 francs, I will take the plans, the maps of Albertville, Briançon, these are forts, towns, fortified towns on the Italian border, but only at 10 francs apiece. And I will take all the plans of Mézières, Longwy, Givet, Evel, Montmédy, Longwy, Péronne, as well as new cartographic maps of both banks of the Moselle and the Meurthe, on where the fortifications are drawn. The new maps of Verdun should be finished, as well as those of Mézières, Charleville-Mézières. All these are forts and military places on the border with Belgium and Germany. And basically, Schwarzkoppen was shopping. He was sending to his spies in the map department of the French army his orders for this and that and the other military map. You can see the three main guys here. On the left is Panizzardi with the high brow, sort of balding. On the right is Schwarzkoppen, who has a very nice mustache, like most people at the time. And the dark beard at the center is Mendigoria. And the American is on the right, and there is a Russian bottom left. But these are the three main characters. Okay, and the Service de Statistique knew that, because the correspondence between Panizzardi and Schwarzkoppen was stolen in the German embassy, but they were stealing correspondences left and right in every embassy throughout. They were taking copies of every single telegram sent by any of the men. This is a copy of information bulletin sent by the Service. which was referring to a false spy the service had managed to place in the employ of Panizzardi, the Italian. And the translation is interesting because it says, a correspondence of our service saw yesterday the Italian military attaché, Lieutenant Colonel Panizzardi, to whom he gives reports we make for his use. The Panizzardi told him that the Italian chief of staff, General Cosenza, who is on an informal footing with me, formally banned me from seeing you and warned me very rigorously that in case I would be compromised, my government, that is the Italian government, would not make any kind of demand to get me out of this trouble. However, the Italian military attaché added, I don't want to lose sight of you, and I want to see you from time to time. But from now on, for both our security, you will write to me in these terms, Colonel, I have the horse you like, which will mean an appointment for the following evening at 9 on Place de l'Europe, which is around Saint-Lazare. So basically, the Italian military attaché was maintaining a network of spies against the specific instructions of his own government and in hiding. And that was not the end of the turpitudes of Maximilian and Alexandro, because they were also doing that. That's a typical letter sent by Panizzardi to Schwarzkoppen because they were exchanging material. For instance, the maps were circulating between the two men. I mean, the German attaché didn't have any use for the map of Briançon, which is in the Alps, but he could give it to his friend, so he was asking for it. And here we have, my dear little green dog, I give back to you 2 volumes of the military journal of 1884 and the note on something. Then I will send you the copy of the 2 chapters I had copied for you. You will give to Mendigoria one of these copies so he can copy it. Goodbye, my little doggy, your buggerer. That's the signature. And you have about 40 letters like that. My dear little dog, fait le beau means, I don't know the English expression, I should have translated it, I'm sorry. It's get on your hind legs and beg. My little doggy, beg please. Here are the journals. I wrote to my brother-in-law to recommend Mr. Rumpf. Count Piola Caselli is warned. Here is a page from the review of Military Circle. Goodbye, my little doggy, beg, Maximiliana. It was, I don't know if you noticed, but the signature here, Maximilian, is feminized. And here, dear Maximilian, am I still your Alessandrina? When will you bugger me? When will you come and bugger me? I will send the paper of advancement and the articles of journals. I'll come soon to be buggered anyway, anywhere. 1,000 hellos from the one who loves you so much, Alessandrina. Okay, we could go on and on. Oh, that's a good one, because that way you can see that this was, sexual behavior among the elites, obviously out of wedding. And also it was not homosexual, it was bisexual. Panizzardi wrote to Schwarzkoppen, 1894, my darling, it could be that this evening around 7, you will be able to see Mrs. Pantalomery, and then you could not be at the meeting place to kiss me. Do whatever you believe you must do, because I will stay over there until 6:10. If I don't see you, this will mean that you are in buona fortuna, which is actually an Italian expression saying you are in luck. All yours on the mouth, Maximiliana. So he used Maximilian's first name and took it on himself as the feminine version of the name. And this is, in this series of correspondence, is found the letter, the Canaille de D. Canaille de D, said, my dear friend, I really regret not having seen you before my departure. Anyway, I will be back in 8 days. Alongside, attached are 12 military maps of Nice that the scoundrel of D gave to me for you. This is from Schwarzkoppen to Panizardi. So Schwarzkoppen is writing that he received the maps for Panizardi. I told him that you didn't have any intention to take up relations again. He claims that there was a misunderstanding and that he will do whatever is possible to satisfy you. He said he was beheaded and you shouldn't be resentful. I answered him that he was crazy and that I didn't think you would want to take up new relations with him. Do whatever you want. Goodbye, I'm in a hurry. Alessandrina, don't bugger too much. In every single publication of this letter, which again is the one letter which was used in the accusation against Dreyfus, the last line is omitted. You will not see don't bugger too much, ne bourrez pas trop, in any book up until Jean-Denis Bredin, who published it without comment in his book, L'Affaire Dreyfus. Before that, no, you didn't see it. So it was kind of surprising. That's what started us. We said, what the? I mean, Léandri, a guy named Bruno Léandri first mentioned it in this editorial, in this comic book magazine, basically, Fluide Glacial, it's called, and attracted our attention to the fact that he made a paper saying, this is incredible. Nobody mentions it, but this is really incredible. And Brodin included also what turned out to be a late fake, which had been produced by the French military. And the late fake was published by Brodin alongside the Canaille de D. And here's what it says. Saturday morning, my dear doggy, yes, my little red dog, I will come to please you. I would be able to stick 1 meter of tongue inside you and all the majors of the 14 armies if need be. Oh, the dirty dog, all yours orgasming. Always Maximilian. This is a complete fake. If you compare, if only the writings, on top right is the writing of Panizardi, on bottom right is the writing of Schwarzkoppen. The letter has nothing to do with either their writing. It's written in a very different hand. It could be an attempt at making them, at blackmailing them. That's been sometimes discussed as letter of the 14 armies. But obviously, this was slid into the file much later. However, Brodin published it, and of course, it raised eyebrows. Now, I'll jump quickly over the next section, which was more administrative history. I'm not sure you were that much into administrative history, but at that point, the Service de Statistique was a huge organization. France had created a deep state, a national security apparatus, which was, for its time, on a par with what the Americans are doing today. It was really, really huge. The center heart of it, the Service de Statistique, was not that big. You had maybe half a dozen people, but hundreds of agents were put at its service, both from the Préfecture de Police de Paris, the police force, which was independent, from the Commissaire des Chemins de Fer, which were the only national force of police in France at the time, and from every single military region. There were 18 military regions. Each of them had 150 men per region, devoted to the service of the Service de Statistique. So you had literally thousands of people, and that didn't even include, for instance, the border guards, which were under strict instructions to report to the Service de Statistique anything untoward they would see on the border. This is the complete organigram of the Service de Statistique, the organizational chart. Basically, it ran, first of all, it depended exclusively from directly the Ministry of War. was actually geographically placed on the other side of the garden of the minister. So it was the closest office in the ministry to the minister's office itself. It had as a direct head only the second sous-chef d'état-major, the adjunct chief of staff, and nobody else. So it was outside the normal hierarchy. It controlled a police spéciale à la frontière, special police at the border, special police in the department, border guards, the territorial information spying and counter-spying organizations in the regional military regions. Gendarmes, that is the military police in the provinces, had to report to them as well. Préfets were supposed to inform them of anything. These are the guys who eventually created Carnet B, you may have heard of it, which was a list of French opponents who were supposed to be thrown into jail at the beginning of the First World War. It was never used, but they were tracking every single opponent in France, and they actually developed a foreign spying system. They had correspondence in most of the foreign capitals in Europe, which led to it being a state within a state. There is a funny incident in which we found a report from the service. The service reported to the Président du Conseil and the ministry, no, actually the Minister of War and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And there is this weird bulletin report, which is annotated by the Minister of War, and the Minister of War says the minister decided there was no, it shouldn't be communicated to the President of the Republic and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the secret document attached, marked with a red cross. So the Minister of War was saying, in effect, okay, there is the weekly report of the Service de Statistique, but we'll pull out of it a certain document. And when you look at the document which was pulled out, it's theft from the Spanish embassy of a report by the ambassador of Spain to his government of an interview he had with Mr. Carnot, who was at the time president of the French Republic, where Carnot was complaining bitterly about his prime minister, Jules Méline. So essentially, the service had stolen a report from the Spanish minister showing that Carnot and Méline were battling each other. And obviously, the Ministry of War decided that maybe it was not a good idea to send to Carnot himself a proof that they had spied on his private conversation with the Spanish ambassador. But the result of this was obviously, that's where it is, and the result of it was obviously that that it had become its own state in a way, which was partly independent and uncontrolled by higher-ups. Okay, we get to the end of it with the plan directeur. Okay, this is another map. I should have pulled it out. Dossier secret. So what's that all to do with it? When you look at the sources, you realize that nobody knows what's in the dossier secret, regardless of what some people say. We'll get back to it quickly. And nobody knows because there were several versions. I'll list them. In 1898, for the first time, Picard wrote in the middle of the whole dust-up a letter to the Minister of Justice, listing what he had seen in the dossier secret. That's the first version. In 1899, when the Cour de Cassation was considering whether to quash the verdict of 1894, Mercier and Gons produced a file in 1897, which was published in 1899 with the second military tribunal and discovered in 2012. In 1899, in Rennes, also in the second military tribunal, a judge from the first military tribunal gave his version of the secret dossier, of the dossier secret. In 1905, for the second revision, the third military tribunal, no, it's not the third military tribunal, excuse me, it's the second Cour de Cassation judgment, which would eventually quash the second military tribunal verdict. The Minister of War mandated an investigator, a guy named Targe, who compiled a file, which was called D1, including a set of pieces dating back to 1892-96, and it seems to be the original dossier as he thought it would look like. And lastly, when we examined what was compiled in 1897, because by that 1897, Mercier and Gons and Henry had turned the original dossier, which was by all accounts between 5 and 10 letters, and that's it, or 8 letters and 2 reports. By 1899, it had turned into a mass of maybe 400 or 500 documents. So the military had drowned the original dossier in a mass of documents, some of them fake, some of them irrelevant. There was a love correspondence between Schwarzkoppen and a lover of his, who was the wife of the Dutch ambassador. There was all kinds of stuff in there. There was a complete correspondence of Panizzardi and Schwarzkoppen. There were all kinds of things. Now, we examined this and we realized still that there was a set of pieces which had a special number on them. And I wonder if I added, yes, there it is. Got it in there. Every single of these pieces were numbered like you see, the numbering of the red quill, and there were very few pieces numbered that way. And also, interestingly, if we added this, what we did in the book was that we took these different versions and we just compared their contents. And that's the whole point. See what pieces are in every version. And if you look at the gray areas, those are the pieces, you'll find the table in the book. Those are the pieces which are in several, at least 2 different versions. Now, unsurprisingly, most of the pieces which were included in 1897 by the military and added to the original file in 1896, 1897 were not found anywhere else. So if you look at the description of Picard, the description of Freistatter, who was actually a honest judge who wanted to tell the truth about Dreyfus, the description of Targe, who was mandated to find the truth, and the Plume Rouge number. These are, they're very common elements between the 4. The 1897 thing is completely off. And we used also the bulletin, the reports of the section to find how many pieces came out of these reports and how many pieces didn't. Okay, so the end result of this was that we decided that if we stuck to those pieces which were numbered in red and present in several of the files, or at least present in several of the files, because we added a piece which was almost everywhere except in the red quill numbers, the structure of the accusation was the following. There was the bordereau, which was off to the side. That was a letter from Esterhazy, which was attributed to Dreyfus. There was a set of 3 to 4, probably 4, accusing pieces. 2 of them contained homosexual allusions. 2 of them didn't. All of them were related to spying. There was a number of pieces, maybe 5 to 6, which were pièces de comparaison, it was called, comparing pieces, but they were not comparing anything anywhere. And these were pieces which were focused on the circle of the military attachés, and more particularly on the love relationship between Schwarzkoppen and Panizzardi. And there were reports, there were 2 notes from a police investigator used by the Secret Service, which were obvious fakes made after maybe included in the 1894 file, because they were copies of reports he had done in the spring of 1894, but they were changed to stress the attitudes and behavior of the military attachés, the fact that they went together on vacation in Megève, on the border of Lac Léman. So there was a whole atmosphere of decadence and there was clearly no spying in these reports, even though the original reports, which had been found by a guy named Marcel Thomas in 1961, which dated back to the spring of 1894, had contained information on spying on the French border. So the spying on the French border, actually, in these extra pieces, was disappeared, so to speak, was erased in favor of considerations on the morality of the military attaches. And we concluded on the basis of this that the dossier secret, which certainly included this and probably the rest of the pieces, was structured so as to put forward the circle of the military attaché and most probably their homosexuality. And that behind it was an intellectual construction which was linking Dreyfus the Jew, whom nobody ever accused of being homosexual, by the way, to a set of homosexuals, foreign, especially the German and the Italian, and that the whole thing made sense in the minds of Sandher and the guys from the Section de Statistique, that it was probably the birth of a certain discourse mixing homosexuality, deviance, generally speaking, foreign threats, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, hyper-patriotism. The whole thing was mixed in this dossier. And it worked, apparently. And also, you can find traces of how this metastasized, and you find it after the Dreyfus affair, in spying networks in Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in the 1900s and 1910s, in the United States in the 1930s and during McCarthy. The link between homosexuality and betrayal, high treason, national security risk was made quite often after 1895. There is no trace of it before 1895. There is no trace of it before the Dreyfus affair. We actually looked up the homosexual scandals of the 1870s, and quite a few of them were implying soldiers and officers. Because soldiers, one of the source of extra income for a soldier was actually prostitution and homosexual prostitution. So you had a number of guys being scooped up by the brigades in charge of repressing prostitution in the Bois de Vincennes. So you have several affairs like that, and none of them contain any kind of indication that there would be a national security risk. The fact that they were soldiers of bad morality was considered bad, and they were, chased, kicked out of the army, but there was no sense that they would spy or anything like that. This is something which happens later on. So there is that. There's also a last, and I will almost conclude with that, there is a last small indication, which comes from Zola. If you read J'accuse closely, J'accuse contains one sexual allusion to the secret pieces, saying that the secret pieces contained a sexual dimension, which Zola claims was little women, low-life women. But he does mention a sexual dimension in the secret pieces used to accuse Dreyfus. And when he died, possibly murdered at the end of his life, he was writing a book called, I think, Vérité, Truth, where he was reporting the story of a school teacher wrongly accused of sexually abusing boys. And I'm not sure it's a complete coincidence, because by that point, another small indication is that at some point the Minister of War tried, not the Minister of War, but the guy at the Gons, who was the head of the general responsible for the Secret Service, also tried to accuse Picard, who had blown up the whole thing, of being homosexual. We have a trace of that. So there are traces here and there of people being aware of what the whole thing was about, and that's it. So we published the whole thing, first in a paper with another guy named Romain Huret, and then Romain dropped out. and was replaced by Pierre Gervais. And we got in a lot of trouble because the main researchers on Dreyfus basically accused us of making the whole thing up, which I have the receipts, by the way. So we had all kinds of very, very, very nasty letters from one of them from Marcel Thomas, who was the head of the Société Internationale d'Histoire de l'Affaire Dreyfus, who basically told us that we were inventing the whole thing, that we invented the whole thing because we're realizing that homosexuality there was not enough homosexuality in the dossier secret to justify a reference to homosexuality, so we titillated the reader by going and selecting extra homosexual pieces, which, as you know now, was a bunch of nonsense, because we actually followed the red numbers originally to try and figure out what was going on. So we didn't pick and choose anything, but there you go. So that's, I will leave it at that and consider how homosexuality was considered in France at the end of the 19th century is a complicated issue, because France was tolerant of it, way more than England, obviously, or even Germany. So one big argument against homosexuality being inserted in the dossier secret was that in France, nobody cared. Well, I think nobody cared is a very optimistic view of the whole thing, and especially in the army, where you could be a homosexual provided nobody knew about it, and it remained secret. And then there was the matter of it being two foreign military attaches, which was complicating the matter even further. So there were all kinds of reasons to think that the homosexual dimension of the dossier, though obviously not as important as the anti-Semitic dimension. Another accusation was that we wanted to do away with anti-Semitism, but Dreyfus was accused because he was Jew, not because he was homosexual. That's clear. But the link between the two may have been made at the time. We think it was made. We cannot prove it beyond a doubt, but it was certainly potentially there in the archives. That's it. Thank you. I think I'll try to stop.
Well, thank you, Pierre, for this brilliant talk. It was very, very interesting.
Okay, wait, just a minute. Just a minute. I'm trying to stop the partage.
Oh, okay. This is, let me see if I can do this here. All right. That's pretty good. Okay.
Thanks. I was, because when you messed that up, you just cut the whole session.
Right.
And I blew up the entire thing, which was not the goal. Okay, sorry, carry on.
Okay, Pierre, thank you so much. This was very, very interesting. As I told you, and we've been talking about this in our seminars, we always think of Adorno's and Horkheimer's interdisciplinary research on the whole phenomenon of anti-Semitism in Europe in the first decades of the 20th century, especially in the writings on the authoritarian personality. And of course, this is a very, very complex question in a research program. But let me start with a very general question just to break the ice. I even posted
yep, so that
on the chat, which is basically thinking that if, as most of us had known of the Dreyfus affair, despite the political emancipation and legal equality of Jewish citizens in France following the Enlightenment, that the Dreyfus affair shows how anti-Semitism was still very much present and was very much all over Europe in the first decade of last century. So the question is, if this form of anti-Semitism is linked to a conservative ethos, which also included homophobia and sexism in that package, say, as in some form of a structural anti-Semitism, would you make an analogy in terms of what we find even today as structural racism. Some people even think of structural sexism and so forth, meaning that although we had the legal separation, let's say, between religion or religious norms and state legal arrangements in the Constitution, and this is something that we can find in different liberal democracies in their emergent experience of democracies all over Western countries. In the case of anti-Semitism, usually people like even Adorno and Horkheimer, they point to more complicated issues relating to the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, dating back to the first centuries of the Christian era. But of course, for modern democracies, what is very interesting in your presentation is precisely because you did the analysis of the legal structure, right, of the Dreyfus affair. And when you point to these, for instance, for the homosexual statements, the very clear proofs of homophobia, you can still have people like these guys who were calling your guys' presentation and your own thesis into question. So meaning that for some people, it's not very obvious that you can establish this connection in terms of a social ethos or the way most people would behave in a certain moment. So I was just curious to see how would you relate this, which of course is a much more, let's say, outrageous manifestation of anti-Semitism, to the way we can perceive even today things like structural racism. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Nita. Then there is a question from Mr. William, but maybe I should answer first.
Okay.
Okay, so we do it in that order. Okay, I'll try to be quick, but it's a very complicated issue, obviously. The first thing is that in France, at least, we tend to distinguish between what we call anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And anti-Judaism is something which is linked to the position of Jews with respect to the Catholic Church at first, and it's something which has been around Europe for the entire early modern, medieval and early modern period, and it was still around quite a bit. But anti-Semitism is something different. It's racial, it's racialized. It's not strictly religious, and it's something which appeared at the end of the 19th century in France as the Dreyfus affair was unfolding. So it's really, there is a chronological coherence in the whole thing. Second, yes, we would think that the connection between anti-Semitism in the racialized sense, racism generally speaking, xenophobia and homophobia and conservatism, a certain brand of conservatism which is combining all these elements together, was very much linked to what we see and was on the rise at the time and blossomed, so to speak, in the 20th century, actually, that it took extra dimension. The gender issue is a bit more complicated, especially today, but even then, we didn't see, I mean, this was a man's world. So it's kind of complicated for us to assess what the attitude would be with respect to gender issues, because these guys didn't even mention women very often. So we're lacking material here. And they have relationships with women, obviously, and there is a whole universe of women out there. But in our we're not, none of those, as we're specialists of end of 19th century culture to start with. So we're, you know, I mean, there are limits to what we can say. What we can say is, yes, we do see the constitution of an ultra-conservative or reactionary, or maybe not reactionary actually, but an exclusionary rather ethos, which is based on, which can very easily combine anti-Semitism, racism, and homophobia. Let's put it this way. That, yes, we see that in the way they talk, and we see that in the way they talk fits with stuff which was seen afterwards from the Action Française, from the 1920s and 30s fascist movements. I mean, you can derive a whole genealogy all the way down to current U.S. Republican discourse on homosexuality and race. So it's really something which is fairly present. Now, the other question was, why would people, I mean, because the other implicit question in your question was, why would people sort of be nervous about it? And that's more local, so to speak. France, maybe because it was, to start with, rather tolerant of homosexuality and LGBTQ behavior, generally speaking, as long as it was not publicized and as long as it was not basically formalized in discourse, is also nowadays, I think, a country where discussing that kind of issue is not that easy yet. And we are certainly in terms of gender and LGBTQ studies, we're way behind other countries because these are considered questions which are not serious. And part of the problem with the Dreyfus affair was that the Dreyfus affair had been very much invested as almost as a civil religion thing around the Republican discourse and the leftist discourse as well as the founding moment of the left and of the Republic and of the rights of man in its 20th century incarnation, and sliding or inserting homosexual issues in there was, one of the guys told me that, actually. He told me, you know, you're just cheapening the whole thing. I mean, we're trying to get Dreyfus in the Panthéon, and you're bugging us with, histoire, depuis, sexual stuff. Stop it. I mean, you're just cheapening it. So that was the reaction. And these are also, I mean, the generation we dealt with was an older generation, which was about 10 years older than we are, which had been trained in the 60s and 70s more in economic and political and traditional social studies. And the cultural studies were associated with, those Americans and wasting their time with cult stud and stuff and Derrida and all these crowd. And this is not the kind of stuff which flies with the guys we're dealing with. So there was this professional disconnect in some ways, but there was also a local political stakes, which was, you don't talk of sex in the middle of the Dreyfus affair. It's just not done. It's like if you're invited, I don't know, you're invited at the Président de la République, you don't mention your personal problems in that respect. You just don't talk about it in public. And that was sort of the reaction. Does that answer at all, or?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, Pierre. Well, let's get to James William. Please go ahead, William.
So thank you, Professor Pierre. It was a great talk. So if I'm getting your point correctly, at least the 30 seconds that tried to build a connection with, like you said, with our team, critical theory, I see that your whole argument makes a case that the Dreyfus affair, it could be a critical moment, a sparking plug to connect homosexual behavior with a particular body, with an origin. Then we have this crossing path with an homosexual body, an origin that is foul, that is bad, that it should be treated. So we could see that when we put the question of the Jewish question with homosexuality, with deviant behavior, then it's a deviant origin, it's a deviant body. Then we can see emerge discussion over the 19th century of normalization, medicalization, and of the body, maybe in some sort of public health to make the body well. And we can see that after that we have eugenesis and all of the following. Is that a fair assessment, that the Dreyfus affair is a critical moment in this proto-eugenesis case that will be made in the later years?
Yeah, that's certainly what we have in mind. Actually, it goes further than that. In the book, we point out that there were strong similarities between the homophobic medical discourse, the anti-Semitic discourse on Jews, and the discourse on spies. And that basically you are very much in all three exactly what you were saying. That is, it's, first of all, it should be accessible to a medical treatment. You have to cure it, so to speak, and you have to cure it by expelling the deviant bodies from, and that goes for Jews, homosexuals, and spies. And you have a whole, actually, homosexuals at the time were considered, as you probably know, were considered sick. They were considered victim of a sickness, and it was a vice, which was the transition from a moral judgment on homosexual to a vice was done progressively, I guess. I'm not an expert on that, but throughout the 19th century. But by the end of the 19th century, it's very much set that it's not a moral issue anymore. It's a technical issue in some ways. And the technical issue is very much also an issue of control, of quarantine, and it goes back to a discourse of complete surveillance, which is very much also what the Service de Statistique is about. There are anecdotes of the head of the Service de Statistique asking a general to come in and saying, look, general, we know you are having an affair with, that was not homosexual, it was an affair with some courtesan, and we know that. You realize that because we know that, other people can know that, you have to have a perfect personal life, because otherwise you're in danger to national security. So there's very much this link made between any kind of deviant sexual behavior, national security, and the Secret Service and the work it's doing. And then on the other side, the Jew side, there is a discourse which is very much an invention, as far as I know, of the second half of the 19th century, that's really late in the game, where the Jew becomes a figure with specific physical traits and specific physical behaviors, which may not, I mean, that's been forgotten a bit, but the typical anti-Semitism of the end of the 19th century, the real racialized anti-Semitism, also includes a denunciation, interestingly, of the sexual overdrive of Jews, who are constantly trying to rape and impregnate Catholic girls, Christian girls. You find that very much like what you find for African Americans in the US. And actually there is at least one case of lynching in the US for reasons identical with African Americans, based on the same discourse of accusing that person. I think it was, his name was Edmund Frank or something like that. Frank, I'm pretty sure it was his last name. And he was lynched somewhere in Alabama and accused of raping a girl, a white girl. So you have also discourses on the sickly green color of the Jew, stuff like that. So you have a whole production, which is very much unified in this respect, and cross-exclusionary, so to speak. I mean, excluding several groups. So I think, I mean, I'm not myself, I'm a specialist, again, I'm a specialist in merchant accounting, so I'm not going to give you a lecture on critical theory because that would be way beyond what I can do. But there is this feeling that there is a discourse out there, which is well identifiable and which is sort of marvelously illustrated by the Dreyfus affair, if you take it a certain way. That would be my answer. Again, not everybody agrees. Be forewarned. So that's something which would, I mean, I know a couple of guys back in France where I would be screaming bloody murder at that point. So maybe we should have invited them as well. But I mean, basically, people like Philippe Auriol and Vincent Duclerc were the two main specialists of the affair. Both wrote pretty aggressive pieces, stopping very short of calling us anti-Semites ourselves, because, well, yeah, I mean, because we were sort of pushing the thing away from anti-Semitism and into other stuff. And we kept saying, look, guys, I mean, it's all the same parcel. I mean, we're not saying anti-Semitism was not important. And again, Dreyfus was never accused of being homosexual, so there is no question there. But, you know, why can't you see? But they don't want to share, basically. So I guess. So that there's that. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, thank you, Pierre. It is really enlightening to reconsider this whole thing. And it's interesting, Pierre, that, as you know, Michel Foucault offered some interesting reflections on this connection in the way William raised the question of the human bodies in Foucault's analysis, especially in his seminars in the Collège de France on the defense of society. Il faut défendre la société. He raised the question of racism as being very much dictated at the turn of 19th century. Well, actually, the whole century, very much as part of white supremacy, European white supremacy project of the conquest and domination of native, indigenous, and African bodies. So that's where Achille Band got his connection for the critique of Black reason. And he explicitly alludes to Foucault's work, because it is very interesting, as you made it very clear in your presentation, that there is some interesting connection in terms of anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, and the whole legal structure, because we cannot forget that we had laws for slavery, right? The whole thing of Jim Crow in the US, as you pointed to, southern US slave system, it was all legal. So you had a legal structure that allowed for all kinds of things. And therefore, it's always very tricky when we're trying to make sense of some kind of a legal normativity without bringing in the whole thing of a moral normativity in terms of the morals, as you mentioned in your presentation, also in your book, relating to the customs, to the way, to the mores, to the way most people were socialized. And as you emphasized, it was in many times very much in the private sphere. Like most people were anti-Semitic, racist, sexist, etc., but only in the private sphere. So that's how it becomes very interesting and even fascinating to think of these comparative studies between racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, for instance, in France, Germany, in England, because we keep thinking of Alan Turing, for instance, the guy who was the real creator of artificial intelligence, as you know of it today. And because he was gay, he was forced, to undertake these treatments because it was a deviant behavior to be homosexual in the 40s. And it's very interesting to see that it always comes down to this idea of normalcy, what is perceived as the normal behavior or to the normal body, etc. And at the end of the day, there is always something moral and especially religious about the the justification for this kind of anti-Semitic, racist, homophobic attitudes. So, guys, we still have a lot of time for questions, and Professor Gervais, feel free to offer us more.
Yeah, Nita, I
comments.
wanted to jump in here because, okay, full disclosure, I'm a historian, and therefore I always had a problem with Foucault because, okay, from where I sit, this is going way beyond my level of competence, so you're allowed to screen. But where I sit, there is a clear difference between the way deviance is treated in, say, the 17th and 18th century, and the way it's treated, like, for instance, in the Dreyfus affair. And the job I did, the work I did on the Dreyfus affair made that even clearer to me, precisely because of that legal angle. There is I'm mostly working on early modern history, 17th, 18th century, and though it's mostly on economics, I end up having this feeling that the law is very important. So if you're deviant, the deviance will be legalized, will be formalized in some ways legally, and it will also be moralized. The two go together. When you think about, or went together, rather, if you think about the way African Americans were treated during the slavery period up to the 19th century, it was, the discussion was whether they were even of the same human origins as the non-African Americans. And even if they were the same human origins, there was always this feeling that due to either because something happened with Noah's when he was drunk or whatever, they were different. They are different, and they are different, and they have a different status in law as slaves, and they should. And so that was the main point. Now, if you move to the end of the 19th century, it becomes a bit different because it's not a question of morality, for one thing. It's a question of, and with the African Americans, actually, it starts before. I would argue it starts as early as 1820, 30. It's not a question of morality. It's a question of your nature, of your inner physical being, and that inner physical being cannot be taken care of by law, because deviance becomes a phenomenon which can be hidden. And if you think about it, even African American slaves, there was the one drop of blood rule. You never know who will not have some African blood in him or her and actually be African, but hidden. Walter Johnson wrote a very good article on this, which I advise everybody to read, which was The White Slave, it's called. It's about a woman who was basically entirely white, except that she was a slave because she was the daughter of slaves. But by 1850, you had 6 generations or 8 generations of mixing, and so she ended up blonde. So that created a problem. But the idea is that it's a very different approach because you can't control it by law. And you end up, I would argue that you end up exterminationist more often than not. If you want to get rid of the deviant body, you have to destroy it. You can't quarantine it legally because it's hidden. because it's devious, because it can, it's like Jews or homosexuals or even African Americans, they can pop up in the middle of normal society and you can't do anything about it because they don't look the part. They can hide. So it's a very different, that's where I was sort of, I've always thought, well, surveiller, punir and all that, that's nice, but there's this shift away from legality, actually. And where the treatment is not legal anymore. You can't have a legal treatment. You must have a medical treatment where you basically cut off their front lobes and or do something like that. And I mean, you're dealing with the natural process, which has to be dealt with in a physical way and not in a legal way. And it's not even, and the counterpoint of that is that it's not a question of morality. It's not because they're nasty, it's because they're like that because of their nature and we have to do away with them. That's pretty much the implication. So so that was that's where I didn't see that in Foucault. I was sort of nervous about his continuum of because it glosses over a gap which I see historically. I think Mr. William has a question.
Right. Go ahead, William.
So I knew Nitamar was going to bring Foucault. I knew that. So yeah, the interesting part, the interesting take that Foucault has is that we can see that the discourse change, the change in discourse, and the difference of justification, and the moment that we rationalize colonization, how we do that? Well, first, we say that they're not human beings, so we can colonize. Then maybe they can't administrate themselves, then they don't have the faculties. Oh, now they're psychological minors. So those changes on just the colonization itself, it happened through 300 of years. So it's a very bold argument, but we can see it's not a continuous trace. It's not you can trace just going a certain path. You can pick some crumbs here and there of reactivations of certain discourses that were rumbling. Like in the Dreyfus affair, we have a rumblings of anti-Semitism, and we have the occultation of homosexual behavior. When you put it together, you have a mixture that can be very detrimental. Then you have something new. Then you can bring something new, and that's not a causal relation. You don't have, it's not unitary, it's not something that you can, I can trace that directly there. No, it's not that kind of argument. It's a constellations argument. It's a more about, well, it's not only the Dreyfus affair, but it's only there's a school of thought that it's rising over there. So it's a very much a much more a constellation of things that have to go a certain way to make something happen. So that's why, and even when you brought up, Professor, the thing about, well, sexuality, we don't talk in public, we talk in private. So that kind of medicalization comes with the discourse when the discourse about treating the body comes to the mind. Well, you talk to your therapist in that safe place, you talk to them about your problems, and then right here you act normal. So yeah, the normalization of the body, that's the kind of argument that becomes the center of the 20th century. And that's what I was trying to say, that the Dreyfus affair can be a sparking plug to this broad discourse of the 20th century.
Yeah,
I don't think you agree, but That's okay.
No, it's not that I don't. It's the thing. Okay, what I guess what I'm trying to argue is for precisely what you were saying, a periodization, which leaves space for major shifts in relatively short time. That's what I would add. I would say I wouldn't change anything really, but I would say okay. And I would see the Dreyfus affair as more as a symptom or as one of the first clear manifestations of a shift, and I would date that shift from fairly precisely from the second third or half of the 19th century. And I would because I would argue, look, once the Valladolid guys decided that yes, the colonized were humans, you get about 3 centuries, which are, I'm not saying they're entirely stable in terms of the way the Europeans treat the colonized people, but there are common tropes. I mean, they're humans, they have a soul, but they are, second-grade humans. Something lower, so we have to take care of them. And anyway, they don't know how to do agriculture. And basically, the debate is, can they learn or not? And you have people who say, just take the Indians and put them in reservations in the U.S. or can't remember the Spanish word in Latin America, reducciones. There you go, and they will learn. And then you have the other guy saying, "Nah, they won't. I mean, they will just stay servants because that's all they can do." But the idea that it's a different category, it has to have a status. That status is relatively stable. Nobody is saying, "Let's kill them all." That I know of. After, I don't know, 1550, 1600, something like that. You get the occasional incident where there is a war starting, and then you get guys saying, okay, let's get rid of them because they're painful. But it's not a position of principle, I would say. It's more a convenience. It's more convenient to exterminate the Indians because that way, we'll have land. And but there is no, that I know of, there is not that much discourse on the basis of these are manifestations of a sickness on the human body, and it has to be eradicated. Then you get after 1830 or 50, and all of a sudden you get a lot of discourses along the line of, let's get rid of them. These are people who are condemned by history to disappear, and disappear physically, not culturally, but actually. I know better the American side because that's what I teach mostly. But you get exterminationist discourses as early as the 1830s, 20s, 30s. That's very early, I think, where you get people like Andrew Jackson saying, we have to push them away because it will buy them a couple decades or maybe a couple of centuries more, but eventually they will die off because there's nothing we can do with them. They can't do anything. They cannot adapt because they are structurally hunter-gatherers, even though, none of them were, but never mind. And so just let them die. And if we can, keep them in zoos for some time, that's fine, but that's the best we can do. And you do get even more, worse. By 1880, you get guys who say, if we want to improve the human race, we have to exterminate all those subhumans because they're actually dragging us down. Plus, we have to forbid intermixing, because if you mix, the superior race, which tends to be whatever race they come from in their own head, with anything below that, we're losing ground. We're returning to the monkeys. So we have to kill them all. And you do get that. And you get the same thing with the Jews, and you get pretty much the same thing with the homosexuals along the lines of, we have to prevent them from having children, for instance. You'll find that. It's transmissible. If it's a transmissible disease, we have to make sure it's not transmitted. And it seems to me there, something which I see in the Dreyfus affair as well, which I link with the hidden dimension. It's hidden. It's there, it's hidden, and we have to destroy it. It's not a question of controlling it. It's not a question of legally framing it. It's a question of actually doing away with it. So it's not a control of body anymore. It's much worse than that in some ways. You don't control the divine body, you just do away with it, which is a very different proposition from the point of view of the divine body, I would argue, because you're not facing at all the same kind of policies. And I mean, there are a number of examples which come to my mind, at least, especially in the US, where it's really, I mean, nobody realizes how close to Nazi Germany the US in 1920 was, but you were talking about a country in which a majority of people considered that you had to sterilize certainly mentally ill people, homosexuals, probably the poor, generally speaking, and prevent them from reproducing because they were lowering the stock. Okay, and you should probably certainly prevent people from marrying anything vaguely dark-skinned. And that probably includes the French and the Italians, because they're Catholic, which is a clear sign of genetic inferiority, for one thing. And so you get that. And the violence implicit in these works is absolutely amazing. I mean, these are guys who are implying that 70% of the world population should be destroyed. That's what they're saying. That's not. I mean, I don't. It's really not something I see under Louis XIV, basically. But I'm not a Louis XIV fan. I'm not idealizing the 17th century. That's not my point. But this kind of discourse is really, I think, is really new, and there is a shift there, which is much more massive and faster than anything before. And that's where that's why I was always of two minds with Foucault, because while I tend to agree with a lot of things he says, it's on the temporalities of the thing, on the rhythm. I've always had trouble because, okay, full disclosure, probably I should do that. I'm a sort of a Marxist. So of course, infrastructure, economics, stuff like that. But I end up thinking, okay, at some point, all these cloud constellations of ideas do exist, and I buy that, and I have no problem with that. But I can see moments or places where it just changes in the space of a lifetime. If you were a guy born in 1790 or 1800, there were a few noises around that. I mean, vaguely. You can find a few traces in Jefferson, who was a particularly nasty guy in that respect. But it's really not commonly admitted. Now, by the time he was 70, he would open his newspaper and find, whole columns. I mean, maybe not the newspaper yet, but certainly the Scientific Review, and he would get Louis Agassiz, holding forth on what must be done to protect the stock or whatever. I've never read Agassiz actually, but he has a bad reputation from where I come from. He was from Harvard, and they actually changed the name of the Harvard Museum because it was the Agassiz Museum until somebody started reading him again and said, look, guys, I'm sorry, but you can't keep him. It's just not possible. So they kicked him out. But I mean, there's this whole pseudoscience brewing in which entire sectors of the human race are just pushed out of it. And not only pushed out, but described as actual threats, which is a different matter, because then it prompts you to do something about it, like kill them all, for instance. So, and you do see that, and that's why the Dreyfus affair is nice, because it's a threat every which way you see. I mean, anyway, so that was my beef with, relative with Foucault. Yeah.
Thank you, Pierre. Yeah, Giselle, go ahead.
Hi. So I was thinking, with the immigration crisis today and the rise of far right, do you see any cases that are similar to the Dreyfus affair, or what can we learn from the Dreyfus affair to avoid this kind of situation nowadays?
If I knew, I would probably patent it. Yeah, it's an easy one. Basically, the Dreyfus affair is a national security state gone amok. It's guys who decided that Dreyfus was a good guilty party because he fit every single stereotype they had, and he could be, folded onto a homosexual spying ring, and the whole thing was really nice and well packaged. Now, you find that fairly regularly in the news, actually, nowadays, for the same reasons. In the past 10 years or so, there was l'affaire de Tarnac. I don't know if you ever heard of that, but basically there is an ultra-left movement in France, which is basically accepting, in principle at least, and sometimes in practice, direct action, as it used to be called, which is basically, hitting cops if you can, and maybe blowing up the occasional building, but that's rarer. Plus you need, technical skills, which most of them don't have. And one incident about, can't remember, 15 years ago or something, was an attempt at derailing a high-speed train. Now, this was done in an area in which there was a well-known ultra-left commune in a village named Tarnac. So the local cops in charge of surveying this, the political branch of the cops in charge of tracking them, decided that it was certainly them, and it would be a good idea to get rid of them once and for all by, hanging that on their to them. And there was like 8 years of procedure, and it turned out, of course, that first of all, it was not them, it couldn't be them. It turns out that, they were geolocalized in the wrong place at the wrong time, couldn't do it. But there was a whole process which lasted for almost 10 years, where this was pushed. And it didn't end up like the Dreyfus affair, because we're not in a situation in which, at this point, the national security state, to call it that way, has universal backing or political backing which goes across the political spectrum. It could change, and so in my view, the question is not so much, is it possible? Yes, it is, always, all the time. The question is, what is the political context which makes it difficult for it to actually happen to the end? That is, until the innocent party is found guilty and sent to jail. Actually, the Dreyfus affair, as far as we know, we speak about that quickly in the book, is probably the second one. There was an earlier Dreyfus affair, but that earlier Dreyfus affair, the Dreyfus in question was a woman of low reputation and no social connection, who fell out with the janitor of the German embassy, who was serving as main source for the German embassy for the secret services. And the woman was railroaded and ended up 15 years in jail or something like that, and nobody talked about her anymore. And we are pretty sure that we can prove it, that the whole thing was a crock, and she was sent to jail by the Section de Statistique to avoid creating problems to the janitor, because she knew he was doing things for them. So typically that's a Dreyfus affair which did take place, didn't end well for the person involved, and was never talked about again. So you get that kind of stuff very often. It all depends on in my view, it all depends on the activity of citizens who don't buy it. and the extent to which that part of the citizenry and even the ruling class up to a point, or the ruling elites who don't like that kind of stuff, the extent to which they do things against it, that's what prevents Dreyfus. So it's really a question of political equilibrium in the end. If you have enough people on the ground and enough people in positions of semi-power, like me basically, or other people who are part of the broader elites. I mean, I'm not Jeff Bezos, but I'm a university professor. I have a good salary. I'm generally well considered, so I can say things. If we and the mass of the people actually react, then it becomes more difficult. Then it's not. But it's sometimes it's very iffy. Even the Dreyfus affair itself, if you think about it, try to think about it with somebody else than Lieutenant Picard in charge of the Secret Service in 1896. And actually, an unfortunate side effect of our book was that we made the other guys, the old guard, so mad that they have started attacking Picard. And one of them actually published a book against Picard, because the problem is that Picard's testimony really backs our thesis. So if they want to destroy our thesis, they have to destroy Picard's testimony, even though he was the first historical Dreyfusard. So it's really unfortunate. But the point I'm making here is that if you look closely, if he had decided to obey and to tell his superior, okay, you want that Jew to stay in jail and you don't want to, condemn his heresy because it's too complicated politically, okay, let's do that. There is no guarantee that Dreyfus would ever have been even heard of again. It's really, so it's both a question of, at the global level, I would argue it's a question of political equilibrium. Enough people who don't agree on processes which don't respect human rights, etc. At the individual level, it becomes a question of dumb luck. So you have to have the right guy in the right place at the right time. Sometimes, not always. I mean, it all depends. But yeah, I mean, but at this point, I would say it's very structural. I mean, if I wanted to go again beyond what I would be able to prove, I would tend to think that it's a structural feature of advanced industrial capitalist societies. You have a very strong administrative structure. You have a very strong tendency in this administrative structure to do away with rules in the name of efficiency, often. I mean, these are not nasty people, but they just think that first of all, they think they're more clever than everybody else, which is a problem. And also they think that they know what to do, and going through the processes, especially the legal processes, is a waste of time. It wastes time, it wastes energy, it wastes money. We can be much more efficient and streamlined by simply taking the decision between the 2 or 3 people who know what's going on, and that will be enough. And that kind of stuff is a recipe for disaster and Dreyfus affairs left and right. So it's really a problem of fighting, ultimately politically, I see it as a problem of fighting the natural trend of current societies to privilege efficiency over every other necessity. And that's something, I mean, you can see it at much lower levels with much lower stakes when fighting with a dumb administrator in a university, because he will tell you that. He will tell you, if we organize things so that I don't have to ask your advice, it would be so much faster, basically. And at least in France, we get that all the time. I don't know about Brazil, maybe you're luckier, but certainly that's what they say. And their deeply held belief is that we don't need, all that stuff. We don't need teachers' meetings, and we don't need all that, and senates, university senates and stuff. Let's do away with that. And that's where, and then they end up doing stupid things, because everybody does stupid things sometimes. So even discounting built-in racism or built-in anti-Semitism and built-in gender discrimination. Even discounting that, you'd still have problems. And when you get that in, then obviously you get a whole bunch of problems. So that would be my answer. It's really a political equilibrium, and I'm not very happy with the current situation, in case anybody had doubts on that. But I don't think I need it.
Well, thank you, Pierre.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, following on Giselle's question and even your comments, it was interesting that you mentioned Jean Jaurès, and I was just wondering, because as far as I can tell from your book and from other writings, that there were many socialists who were anti-Dreyfusards, right? So again, we can see this kind of mixed feelings on the part of even a communist and a socialist when it comes to anti-Semitic, homophobic, sexist issues. Can you offer any more comments on this? I was just, and relating to this, Pierre, before I forget, I was curious to know what would you say about the École d'Annales, especially first generation of the Annales school relating to the Dreyfus affair. Thank you.
Okay, several things. The Annales school they were left-wing. They were very much, Madeleine Robert wrote a whole bunch of things about the link between the Dreyfus affair and actual history. And it's part of it, actually it's something I forgot, it's also part of why, sex was so bad when it came to the Dreyfus affair, because the Dreyfus affair inaugurated serious historical studies, even in the way the military construction was deconstructed, so to speak. But precisely because it was at the source of serious historical studies, it shouldn't include non-serious historical topics. That was also part of it. But basically and then I forgot the first part of the question, of course, which was rats. You started with, what was the first part of your question? I have a hold there.
Well, the whole thing about socialists and communists at the time of,
Yes. Okay, well, it's linked in a way. So you have this view of scientific inquiry, which is dispassionate, which is unconnected to emotions, sex, culture. These were very much scientists. They were very much in the post-positivist tradition. They believed in science. They believed in objective. You read Marx, he believes in science, of course. You have a science of man. You have a science of history. You have a science of the future. You can predict things, even if you're good enough. Now, Jaurès and the socialist movement started against Dreyfus because Dreyfus was a captain in the French army, and the French army was killing miners left and right. These are people, the French army was used at Fourny, the French army was used to shoot up strikes, the French army was used in, of course, obviously, not even going that way. If you go to the Commune, you're talking about anywhere between 10,000 and 100,000 people killed in Paris from the working classes by the army. It was the army. So you end up with an army captain. Nobody's really excited about defending an army captain. And then you have strands of the French left, especially the Guedistes, Jules Gued and the Northern Socialists. They have a tradition of maybe not anti-Semitism, but, money is bad, the Jews are money, blah, blah, stuff like that. You do find that after 1870. In fact, Henri Rochefort from Le Lanterne started in the left wing and ended up anti-Dreyfusard and in the extreme right because of that. So condemnation of money, condemnation of the army. Dreyfus was from a rich family on top of it. He was son of a dynasty of manufacturers from Alsace. So there was no reason for socialist leaders to be particularly sympathetic to Dreyfus to start with. Now, the difference with Jaurès and other guys and Clemenceau who came to his rescue was they didn't think the individual was important. Or more accurately, they thought that the process was more important than the individual. And that because the process was putting into question the entire inheritance of the Enlightenment, basically, the separation of powers, justice, what it should be, the judicial process, legal protections, all these were done away with in the case of Dreyfus. And for people like Jaurès and Clemenceau, that was a no-no. These were tools which were useful to the workers' movement. That was their assessment. And it's probably one of the big fault lines which will appear after 1917, because I don't think in the post-Leninist communist movement, precisely this was discussed. I mean, Lenin very, very clearly said, look, guys, you know, formal bourgeois things, that is very nice, but this is not helping us. So I'm not going to defend the legal process, because that's really not getting us anywhere. And on the other side, you have people like, the German reformists and Blum and all the other crowd who are saying, it's very useful. It's doing us all kinds of good fighting against the Kabbalists. So please, be careful about what you ask. Plus, if you do away with it entirely, we're looking at what you're doing in the Soviet Union in 1927, and we're not sure we're happy with it. So there is this whole debate about the rule of law behind it, and Jaurès and Clemenceau fell clearly on the side of we need it. And it was not the case of all the left. And Gued was way less enthusiastic about Dreyfus. And a guy like Professeur actually moved to the extreme right because of Dreyfus, because he said, no, we're not defending that guy. That's ridiculous. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Pierre.
You're welcome.
Well, we could spend the whole, for Pierre, it's afternoon. For us, it's the whole morning.
You need to go to lunch.
Right. Well, we still have some minutes left. Anyone else would like to raise a question? Please feel free to just raise your hand or just open your mic and ask your question.
Questions. Good. It means I was clear.
All right.
Okay.
Well, once again, Pierre, let's say thank you once again, and say how much we appreciate it for this whole discussion, for the beautiful insights you offered about this very important moment in French history, and also for our own understanding of the relationship between history and the social sciences. It's very, very much part of our research program. Thank you very much, Pierre.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.